Hi there. Today we're talking with Maria Cardona, regarded as one of the top 100 most influential Latinos in America. We're very excited about having you join us today, Maria.
Thank you so much, Janice. It's my pleasure to be here today, and I'm looking forward to our discussion, which hopefully the grad students will get a lot out of.
Well, great. Let me just give a brief introduction, although we have read your full bio, for those who haven't. Maria Cardona is a principal at Dewey Square Group, a public affairs firm in Washington, D.C., where she founded the first Latino strategies practice called Latinovations, which we'll talk about a little bit further in our conversation. It helps to guide clients on best practices for engaging the Hispanic community. Mm-hmm. Now, with over 2 decades of experience in a public policy advocacy and as a political strategist, she currently is a political commentator with CNN, and in the past was senior advisor on Hispanic outreach with Hillary Clinton's 2008 presidential campaign. Now, her full bio is on our website. So, Maria, I can see that we have a lot to learn from you in this short conversation, so let's make the best of it. Perhaps we could begin by getting maybe an example from you on how you've helped a specific client, perhaps someone initially reluctant with reaching emerging markets.
Sure. Well, Janice, before I get into that, let me just start by pretending that I am talking to a client and make some very important points that I think perhaps clients maybe thought that they knew, but perhaps didn't really understand the impact of what it is that they were looking to do and why they should have a focus on the growing and expanding Latino community in the United States. So right now, the Latinos are 1 in 6 of Americans, of residents, of people who live here in the country. In 2050, that statistic will be 1 in 3. That means that 1/3 of Americans will be of Latino descent. When you are talking about that kind of growth, every single company and frankly, every single governmental entity or political campaign has got to think about how they are going to reach the largest and fastest growing demographic in this country. And from a public policy standpoint, as well as from a corporate standpoint, these are the people that are going to be impacted the most by whatever regulation or legislation that you pass. And from a corporate standpoint, these are the consumers that you are going to want to reach if you actually want to expand your bottom line. So when I put it in that angle and sort of with that prospect in mind, I think it is sort of an aha moment for the client in terms of really understanding why it is that they need to do this. They've all seen the census numbers, but I think until you look at it with that sort of simplicity in mind, you don't really understand the impact. So that is what I like to lay out for clients before we go into what it is that I think they need to do. So as an example, I have been working for a very long time for a telecommunications company. And this was a company that had for a very long time a very good relationship with the Hispanic community. They had been there for sponsorship of different events around the country. They had been there for whatever events, and they were invited to by Latino organizations who had a relationship with this particular company. But I think until my team started working with them, they really didn't understand the kind of programmatic partnership that was important to have with the Hispanic community in order for that relationship to be authentic and to be long-term. And what I mean by that is that so many clients look at different demographics, and not just the Hispanic community, but let's say African-American groups, Asian American groups, even women's groups, as groups that they have to cater to, that they have to buy a table at their annual convention, for example, and that is enough because they show up, they check the box, they have their branding, and to them, that is what they need to be doing. When in fact, what they should be looking at is how do you develop and how do you nurture a real partnership with different organizations that represent these different demographics, where they can go into a community, for example, and talk about how you try to reduce the dropout rate among Latinos, as an example. Talk about how you try to bring in more healthy living, more better health care, if you will. And companies can have a real impact when it comes to those kinds of things. And when you look at it that way, it stops becoming a sort of quid pro quo relationship, and it starts becoming something that is genuinely real, that is a mutually beneficial relationship and friendship that is not just on a yearly basis, but it turns into something that is long-term. And that, for the bottom line from a corporate standpoint, is something that I believe is invaluable.
Oh, thank you for sharing with us in such great detail. I know that my students will incorporate that into some strategies that they're thinking about for some of our assignments, as well as in their future careers, I'm sure. So I'm thinking about something here. Does your experience with multicultural publics and multicultural public affairs inform and or contribute to your success as a television political commenter, or does it work the other way around?
I think both ways. And what I mean by that is that certainly the experience that I have had, obviously growing up as a Latina, but also from a professional standpoint, having studied the kinds of impacts that different corporations or different governmental entities and different campaigns have had as they've tried to reach the Hispanic community, as well as the extensive research that I have been involved in when I've worked on political campaigns. For example, when I worked on Mrs. Clinton's campaign in 2008, we did all of the polling. And before that, I did all of the polling for another group that essentially led the Democratic Party's efforts to reach Latinos in the 2004 presidential cycle. So all of that has absolutely informed how I talk about public policy issues on national television from the standpoint of how it impacts different demographics, in my case, specifically the Latino community. And what I think has been so gratifying is that people and viewers and commentators and reporters especially are hungry to really understand what that means. And the reason why is because we have seen so many political campaigns really try to cater to the Hispanic community for the same reasons that I laid out earlier, right? The consumer base is growing among Latinos. The demographic is growing in and of itself. From a political standpoint, the Hispanic vote is not just growing, but it is becoming much more impactful in terms of what it does to elect or to deny the presidency to a certain political campaign or a certain political candidate. And that also applies to elections at the local level. For example, you mentioned New Mexico earlier. New Mexico is a place that has a massive Hispanic population. The Hispanic vote in New Mexico is incredibly important, and anybody who is running for office there understands that. I'm really good friends with Governor Richardson, for example, and he knew from the get-go, as a Hispanic himself, how important it was to reach out in an authentic manner to the Hispanic community in New Mexico. And specifically, what strategies do you need to reach them? And what is also incredibly important, I think, for reporters and for potential elected officials, and also, frankly, for corporations who are looking to reach this demographic, is that it's not something that you can just turn on a dime for. So it's not one strategy fits all. The Hispanic community is not monolithic. They're very different depending on where you live, depending on the ethnicity where you're from, for example, and depending on what language you grew up speaking. So I am fully bilingual. I came from South America, from Bogota, Colombia is where I was born. I was very lucky to have my parents understand and I think accept the importance of being able to speak two languages. So they raised me and my brothers speaking only Spanish at home because they knew we were going to learn English outside of the house. There were other folks, though, who did not have the same experience as me, who grew up in the Southwest when there was a lot of racism and a lot of backlash for families who did continue to speak Spanish, and they did completely the opposite for obvious reasons. And they pushed upon their kids to minimize their Spanish language, especially outside of the house. They pushed them to speak English even at home. And as a result, they lost their ability to read and write and understand Spanish. We're now coming to a point in this country where it's not just a privilege or a plus to speak Spanish, but depending on where you live, it can also be a necessity. And so from the understanding of language, understanding of ethnicities among the Hispanic community, you can also put together very significant and impactful strategies in order to reach all of the different constituencies that exist within the growing Hispanic community across the country.
Well, now that leads me to ask you about Latinovations.
Okay.
Did you know from the very beginning what it should be or what it would become as it is today? Could you, or how did it develop?
Sure, that's a terrific question. So when I came to work for Dewey Square, I was intrigued and very fascinated by all of the different services that they offered their clientele. So for example, Dewey Square started as a premier grassroots firm. And what that means is they put together grassroots campaigns depending on where the client needs to push their message, where they would figure out what is the best message to push the constituency or the voters in that specific state or city. And then they would put together messaging around it. They would put together events. They would put together different strategies to reach those voters and then to influence how it is that they thought about a specific issue. So in addition to grassroots, then they added on a communications ability, because obviously you can't really push a message nationwide if you don't have the capability to speak to the media in an effective way. So they brought on board some of the most effective communicators that we have seen, and a lot of people that come from Dewey Square, actually most everybody that is here at Dewey Square comes from presidential campaigns. And so you have communicators that have worked on presidential campaigns. You have the folks who worked on presidential campaigns that have put together the local strategies, and that's where sort of the grassroots practice grew out of. Then you have a strategy that we call a state and local, and that is the capability to reach state and local elected officials and state and local influencers for the same reason, to get a message to them so that they can get the message out locally to their constituencies, and that way move the needle from a public policy perspective. And so I saw all of these capabilities as incredibly important. And then what I realized was I could help Dewey Square do all of those things, but specifically focused and geared toward the Hispanic community nationwide. And so the way that I designed it with my colleagues in Latinovations and the way that we pitched it to the partners at Dewey Square is, look, we want to recreate what Dewey Square does, but we want to make sure to focus it in a way that clients can do all of this, but we can do it specifically focused with the Hispanic community. And since I come from a communications background, I essentially already had the capability and the knowledge from a messaging, a press, and a communication standpoint. Because most of my experience was also working with Latino leaders across the country at the local, state, and federal level, I also had the state and local capability as well as the grassroots capability. Because the other thing I had done is, in addition to working with Hispanic elected officials, I was working also with national Hispanic organizations that had local affiliates that also were very influential in whatever public policy debate was going on. And so I had all of those personal relationships that I could bring to bear for clients, of course, depending upon whether I thought it was a good message to bring to the Latino community, that I thought could be incredibly effective to offer that capability to clients when they were really understanding and accepting the importance of adding a communications capability with the Hispanic community.
Right. Yeah, I really appreciate. I'm feeling a little echo here. Let's stop there, Freya. I appreciate the much better. I appreciate the thoroughness that you went into there for us to understanding how this very important entity came to be. I'm going to take you back a little bit further now,
okay,
and ask you about when you were a student at Duke.
Okay.
What advice do you wish you had received when contemplating a career in public affairs, multicultural affairs, diversity marketing? Can you go back there and think about and give some advice to our students now?
Sure. So it's interesting. I loved my years at Duke, and I thought it was obviously some of the most important years of my life. I wish I had taken more marketing classes, and this is going to sound maybe not counterintuitive, but maybe a little bit strange. I wish I had taken more classes either in psychology or sociology.
Yes.
Because I really believe that marketing and communications and frankly public policy, which is what I ended up majoring in at Duke. They were one of the premier universities that ever had a public policy major. I think so much has to do with the public psyche and really understanding how that works from a marketing standpoint or even from a sociology standpoint, I think would really have given me just sort of an extra understanding of how to approach some of the strategies, perhaps earlier on than what I came to on my own with experience and with the different kinds of jobs that I had the ability to get after I graduated from Duke. But I look back on that and I sometimes say, wow, if I had taken this or that course in sociology or in marketing or even in psychology, I might have been able to bring a little bit more to my job prospects, if you will, once I had graduated from the university.
I can relate to that very well. All right, now let's come all the way full force to today, as it relates to the 2016 election. Mm-hmm. Okay, what are some of the broad strategies you or your team have sought to enact to engage the Latino electorate? Mm-hmm. And another question, do you think these efforts will be validated come next November?
Terrific questions. So several issues have arisen in the past, I would say probably 2 presidential cycles that have become absolute lightning rods for the Hispanic community. One of them is immigration, and the other one is ballot access. And what I mean by that is not necessarily, having the ability to go vote, even though essentially that is what it means. But the overall tendency in the last 2 presidential cycles for states to, that we're seeing that states are passing much more difficult legislation that makes it a lot harder for people of color to go vote, in essence. And so what that has done to the Hispanic community is that it has energized and it has mobilized them to take a stand. What you see across the board with Latino organizations is that one of their number one priorities and number one goals is to make sure that they are able to, every election that comes around, to increase the number of Latinos that are eligible to vote, and then to get them out to the polls to vote. And in all honesty, it has been frustrating. It has been very challenging because we are still at a point where, even with all of the numbers and all of the news that I'm sure people have heard about how the 2008 election, you had record numbers of Latinos coming out to vote. The 2012 election had record numbers beyond that had Latinos coming out to vote. And the number of Latinos that came out to vote in 2012 did not hit 50% of the eligible Latino voters that live in this country. So if you can imagine, as big as the Hispanic vote is growing, as impactful as it has been, and we are still voting at less than 50% of our capability, imagine Latino leaders when they talk about, if we increase that by 20%, by 30%, this could be a real powerhouse when it comes to legislation. We would already have had immigration reform passed. We would already have had, all of the different legislative proposals debunked in the state legislatures if our vote were to match the numbers that are actually eligible to match if we came out to vote, and if people came out to register, and if the population of Latinos who are eligible to become citizens to then become eligible to vote, it's just massive. And so I think this is it has been both frustrating, but it also, I think, gives us tremendous hope for the future in terms of what can be done. Because certainly what we have seen, with the tendency of Latino voters becoming even much more impactful, we have also seen a backlash on the other side of the kind of detrimental and frankly hateful rhetoric that has come from the extreme right wing in this country, that has been very hurtful to Latinos, has been very hurtful to immigrants. And Latinos are now essentially responding to that by trying to mobilize and by educating their constituencies to say, look at this, we can't stand for this. Stand up and go vote. And essentially, they don't tell people how to vote, but they know very well which parties and which candidates are the ones who are doing the damage to Latinos in the country. And it's been very interesting because as a Democrat, right, I obviously wear my political affiliations on my sleeve. And I was very proud of the fact that President Obama in 2008 was elected with a huge margin of the Hispanic vote. And then in 2012, he was able to grow that margin up to 71%. But I also know that a lot of the support the Democrats have gotten from Latinos isn't necessarily because they love Democrats so much. I mean, yes, more Latinos do identify with the Democratic Party, certainly, than the Republican Party, but it was more so a show of solidarity with the community. They were going to stand up to the party that they thought was being hateful, that they thought was being, frankly, racist and anti-Hispanic, and they were going to show them that that is not something that they can do and say and get away with. And incredibly, it has worked on a presidential level. In 2008, the Hispanic vote defeated the Republican Party. In 2012, they defeated the Republican Party. What is happening in 2016, in all honesty, is nothing less than baffling, because that kind of rhetoric has only become worse. And it has become worse from the current front runner of the Republican Party. And so what we're seeing now is that dynamic of the Hispanic community feeling like they're under fire and then responding with mobilization is now at sort of 10 times that. Yeah. So hopefully we will be able to surpass 50% of the voting population in 2016, because I have seen so many organizations and Latino leaders really try to focus on that we have to stand up for our community, that we can't let this kind of rhetoric go on, that we have to stand up for ourselves and show that there will be a backlash and that there will be a price to pay for folks who think that they can talk about Mexican immigrants as being rapists and criminals, and that's not something that we can stand for. And so going into 2016, it's going to be very interesting how the Republican Party understands that they really will never get to the White House if they continue down this path of the kind of hateful rhetoric that they have engaged in for the past 2 presidential cycles. And I'll give you a couple of statistics. In 2004, President Bush had a fantastic pollster. His name was Matthew Dowd. And Matthew Dowd came out with a report that essentially said that President Bush would not be able to be reelected as president in 2004 without at least 40% of the Hispanic vote. And indeed, that is exactly what he got in 2004, and he was reelected. Since then, given the growth of the Hispanic vote in this country, that percentage has gone up at least 5%. So today, you have a Republican Party that has zero path to the White House if they can't get at least 45% of the Hispanic vote. Right now, they are barely getting to 20%, given, again, the kind of hateful rhetoric that they've engaged in. And so from the standpoint of winning a general election, Republicans understand that they are in a deep hole with Latinos and frankly with other demographics in this country. We would need a whole other session to talk about how hurtful they've been to women and to the LGBT community and African Americans and you name it. But specifically for Latinos, this has been and I've talked to several Republican strategists who are baffled by the kind of language that is being used by their candidates on the Republican side, because they know that they'll never be able to get to the White House with that kind of language. But the problem for them is that they also know that, or at least they believe, that if they don't engage in this kind of rhetoric, that they won't be able to win the Republican nomination. Because during the Republican nomination is when you have some of the most extreme voices are the ones that are most active, are the ones that actually spend the time to go caucus. And that takes 2 or 3 hours on a cold winter night in Iowa. And they are the ones that are most mobilized. And so it's a real challenge for Republicans right now, because on the one hand, they have to speak to the most conservative votes. And they think that one way to do it is by demonizing every other demographic that is growing in this country, including Latinos. And then on the other hand, they know that they can't get to the White House without trying to attract additional Hispanic votes. So they are in a real conundrum. Right. And, I say that, it's really fascinating for me as somebody who has been involved in political science for so long. It's thrilling for me to say that as a Democrat.
Well, you know what? I'd like to say right now that this is October 2015 that we're talking today. And I'm just wondering if maybe I could invite you back a year from now.
I would love that. Absolutely.
Yeah, to talk about what we've seen happen.
What has happened. Absolutely. I would love that.
That would be great. I do have one final question for you.
Sure.
And this time I'm going to ask for some career advice.
Okay.
How important is and was growing a diverse network as it relates to your success today?
Oh, that is such a great question. It is incredibly important. And let me just admit to you now, I didn't do enough of it when I was younger and when I had just graduated college. And that's one of the other things. There are very few things that I would change. I've been very lucky in my path towards my career and where I am now. But I certainly would have loved for somebody to tell me that having a diverse network that is nurturing, that is vast, and that is a network that represents what this country looks like today would be incredibly helpful for me throughout my career. And, again, I've been very lucky. I've had tremendous mentors throughout my life. But I would have loved to have a network of peers that could have helped me along the way. And that is something that I always tell whenever I am talking to young college graduates, to young college students, to young Latinas who always come up to me after I finish a speech and they ask me for my advice, I say, look, you know, especially today with the vast networks and I think that the rich and robust nature of social media, and sure, there are downsides with social media, but I think one of the greatest things that social media has brought us is the facility with which we can nurture those vast networks and the facility with which we can have our own voice within those vast networks. So what I would say to the college students is two things. The first one is absolutely nurture those networks. Get to know people who are different from you. Get to know people who look different, who sound different, who like different things, because that is one way to really understand what this country is going through, the changes that this country is going through, and who we are becoming. And that, I think, is going to be incredibly valuable for anybody who wants to be successful, frankly, in any field today. And then the second thing would be is to really have an open mind and to look at every experience as a plus. And I'm sure that, you know, as graduate students who have heard people come in and to give them advice before, they've heard this before, but don't be afraid of failing. Don't be afraid of standing up and trying new things and being creative and listen to your gut. Can I just tell you, the times when I have sort of looked back and regretted either a decision or a pathway that I have taken, I can always look back and pinpoint the very specific date and time when I didn't listen to my gut. Yeah. When I had a gut feeling that I should do something, and then I said, oh, well, but maybe not. I think this is, and I can always go back to say, I should have listened to my gut. Your gut is there for a reason, yeah. And you should learn to trust it.
I think there's a lot of nodding heads right now. Well, you know, we've come to the end of this wonderful conversation, but what you've shared has been so very helpful to our study of our field.
I hope so.
And it will certainly be influential in many students' career paths.
I hope so. It's been a pleasure. I love doing these types of things. Yeah. So just let me know whenever you need something.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Maria Cardona, for joining us today.
I appreciate it. Have a great day.